Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, first and foremost, I'd like to welcome you to our very first report launch in cyber on Zoom. Normally, I think you're used to us doing webinars and these kind of discussions, and today we've decided also to go a step further and do some of our other activities online as well. So we're very, very excited to have one of our speakers from one of our other events, Mohammed Al-Suwayed, who has taken the time today to join us to launch his paper. We published it about 2 weeks ago. It's called Saudi Bureaucrats Incentives, Jeopardize the Vision 2030 Implementation Plan. It's a very, very detailed study. I'm not going to tell you what it's about. It's not a surprise novel, but we're lucky we have the author here with us today, and he'll do the explanations. But I do want to underline the fact that we're very excited that Mohammed is with us today to go into detail about what his research was, what his findings were. And this way we can open up, I think, a very important, a much needed discussion, not only about Saudi Arabia and Vision 2030, but also about bureaucratic cultures and how bureaucracies around the world have changed for various different reasons under different circumstances. But using the case of Saudi Arabia, I think it's very informative to other situations around the world. So I think there's a very good opportunity that we have. I will moderate today for Mohammed. I should say Mohammed is a true economist. I think he's very much aware of not only economic life and trading life, but he's also very much aware of the intersection between trade and policy, between institutions and development. He was the former head of the Vision Realization Office for the Ministry of Transportation, which also means that he's got a good insight into infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure as well. And so I think what we'll be able to get from today's talk is only touching the surface of the specialization of Mohammed. And I'm sure that, and I hope, inshallah, that he comes back to us with other reports and other research, because so far it's been really very positively received. So for today, methodologically, what we'll do is we'll turn the floor almost immediately over to Mohammed, who will do introductory presentation, go over the main points of his paper, and then from there I have just a small selection of questions to ask to Mohammed directly, and that will be followed by an open question and answer period, so that the audience, you'll all have the opportunity to ask Mohammed questions. Please do so not in the chat section, but under the question and answer section, which will be open. I mean, it's open now, but so as Mohammed is speaking, feel free to drop your questions in there, and we'll do our very best to make sure that everybody's questions are answered. So without further ado, I will turn the microphone over to Mohammed. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Mitchell, for the introduction, and thank you so much for the support and the opportunity to present my findings in the paper through the center and to the world. We'd like to discuss the rest of the papers, and even sometimes, even if you like it would be for the audience to speak about some other stuff. So this is the three sections that I would like to go over with you right now. And the paper, as you see, we're talking about the probability of failure in the implementation of Vision 2030. We're not talking about the failure of the vision, no, the failure of the implementation of the vision. And then we'll delve into the roles overlap within the Saudi Vision 2030 governance structure. As you might see later, some of the pictures that were taken in here in the presentation has been updated on the website of the Vision 2030, but it's still kind of like have the same main, let's say, structure that it started with in 2016. And then at the end, we'll have a look at the policy recommendation. So the paper is all about the incentive of the bureaucracy and how it impacts the implementation of any plan, not just the. So the thing with this incentives impacts and implications, it has been in the system since the beginning. If you see at the chart, like it's the same chart that you've seen in the paper, show you the relationship between the economy and the growth in the economy and also the budget spending. And you see how that the correlation is almost perfect, even you know, with the recent changes in budget 2017, the relationship has not changed. It's just kept almost perfect until now. So it's a very old problem. It's been in the inception. And in my opinion, the reason why we still have the problem until today, and it's going to continue, is that the reform of the government, of the bureaucracy, actually is an unfinished project, because it started by of course King Abdulaziz and then King Saud, but it's also, I mean, the whole civil service and all the other bureaucracy sections was actually was built and evolved during King Faisal time. And then, of course, because it's the reason why it's unfinished projects, because it was killed in the middle of it. So so that's why we still have the same complications. The complications that we have today is just the source of that. And as you might not notice, I mean, you might notice also during this presentation and in the paper, is that the complex system of the bureaucracy actually doesn't allow autocracy in the system. If you notice the MBS, I mean, for all the kings, not just King Salman or MBS, it's also King Abdullah, King Khalid, King Fahd. It's the same complexity, but we are lucky now to see it clearly because of Vision 2030 and all the reform that's been happening right now. And if you notice the latest interview by MBS, he actually referred to some of the complexity in the system, and that it's not everything is done by him. That's not a PR talk. That's reality. Like it's the system, the complexity in the system doesn't allow really autocracy. I mean, the top-down decisions, because it's built differently. The reason why it's built differently, let's look at the bureaucrats behavioral drivers. Usually the bureaucrats, they're supposed to be driven, like if you look at all the literature there, by two things mainly: maximizing their well-being and maximizing budget size. That's the bureaucracy. But because it's different in Saudi, because they have the legislative function, they're also incentivized differently as well. They're incentivized by term renewal, personal power interest, if you want to look into it, political agendas like business owners, citizens, technocrats, and all that stuff. So it's also, kind of like influenced by that completely. So from my understanding, I feel like bureaucrats actually get confused when they get appointed or elected because of both incentives, because they're not used to, especially if they're in management most of their life. Second, if you think about it differently, ministers are not really appointed. I mean, they seem to be appointed, but they're being elected at their positions, at their posts. So it's kind of like a different perspective when you look at it from a bureaucracy and legislature point of view, because it's two different institutions. And one of the things that we probably lived through the whole years is that legislations or whatever laws or policy making has been taking place in the past 20, 30 years, we would notice that sometimes stakeholders can, benefit on the expense on another stakeholder because of this process, because it's really not stable in term uh, of, of course, the other stuff that was talking about here, the political agenda on the incentives on the other column there. So here's what it looks like when you look at their roles. This would make it actually more clear when you see, when you read about the implications of having mixed incentives, is that they have both of the roles, the executive and the legislative roles. See in the yellow, in a normal government, you would have two separate institutions. Each institution would have that would actually help them in performing the checks and balances principles there within the government system. But here and in Saudi Arabia, like in the Council of Ministers, you'd see because both roles are in the same institution, there's no checks and balances, like institutional checks and balances between the two branches, because it's almost as if it's one branch. Included in one branch. And as you read in the paper, when you think about it, so if they're performing both roles, are they politicians in control of bureaucracy, or are they bureaucrats in control of politics? So it's kind of comes both ways, because they have both of the functions. And some of the implications, that's too much focus, as you read, on quick wins, because one of the incentives for a minister there is to get his term renewed, because he's been elected, he's not being appointed. That's the difference between the two actions. So there'll be more focus on quick wins, so the terms would be renewed. Otherwise, if he was a bureaucrat, he would not really be focusing on quick wins a lot. He would use quick win, but it would be limited to the overall plan in general. And one of the other implications is that because they have both functions, one of them going to have to affect the other negatively. So that's why we see a continuous and constant disruption on the execution plans or executive roles, which includes the action plans that were taken, whether we're talking about the Vision 2030 or the plans that were taken place back in the 5-year plans. If you know, in the past 20 years, that was kind of implemented after King Faisal. So to conclude on this, if you would think about it, is that if there is no checks and balance in the system, then how is the checks and balances are happening? Is that, picture it like this. Checks and balances in the system happens between the king and the crown prince and the rest of the bureaucratic system. So it's not really it's a big, huge burden on the king that, it will be really overwhelming. That's why MBS, if you noticed, and since the start of the vision, there was a governance structure that was introduced, and then there was the CEDA, the Council of Economic Development, that would help, help him out with the checks and balances that he needs to actually deal with the system. But still, it still is going to be one person, the king and the crown prince, against the whole bureaucratic system in terms of checks and balances. So that's what it looks like. And then we come to one of very important organizational implication. And there's some things I didn't really mention in the paper, because that one part needs a lot of information that are not available, I think, public. But only few or little information is available, is how the legislation process is happening in the system. You've seen there's the way to introduce a legislation in the government is a ministry has introduced it to the Council of Ministers, and it's going to take a process where it has to go through review by other ministries and then go to the Bureau of Experts, and it's going to go through a process until it reaches, and of course goes to the Shura Council, and then it goes back to the king for approval. And if not been studied or done satisfactory, or the king does not believe that it needs more studies, like study or analysis, he would send it back to probably the Bureau of Experts to go it over and review it, and then approve it at the end. So if you notice this is what it's called. I mean, this is what I believe is the decision-making process within a legislature institution, which is bottom up. It's not top down. Where in a bureaucracy or a management, the decision-making process has to be top down. So this is where it gets even more complicated within a ministry, like in a bureaucratic institution in Saudi, is that because they have both of the functions, the decision-making process is actually confused. So sometimes the executive role will be done bottom up instead of top down. And, and that's like really complicated for an execution, because you need a control, you need efficiency, you need it fast. So that's not how that's the reason why some of the projects, some of the programs are being delayed, whether in infrastructure projects or any other projects, because of that reason. And then there's another thing where in the entrepreneurial, the legislature institution, you would need a lot of entrepreneurial leadership styles and stuff to get things done and changing and risky and all that. So usually the structure of it will not be comfortable with a control culture as an organization or a top-down decision has to be bottom up. So both of them, if you look at the chart in front of you, there's a framework called the competing value framework that would describe to you what it looks like if you want a control culture or an entrepreneurial culture in an organization, which is what the diamond looks like. So the diamond in yellow, that's what the entrepreneurial organization culture or structure in general, or in leadership and all that. It will have to go towards the create quadrant, because it has to be changing, innovative, and all that stuff. There's no consistency in it, consistency or efficiency or control in it. It has to be like free, flat organization and all that stuff. But while in the other diamond shape, that it's like the clear, it points toward control. That's where you need in a bureaucracy, because it needs control, it needs efficiency, it needs this kind of leadership and this kind of culture. And for those from the private sector, I could explain it even much clearer, is that if you look at the structure of corporate governance, is exactly based on the basics of principles of separation of powers and functions within a government. You get the shareholders, you get the board, you get the management. So you can actually compare it to a government where the shareholder is the constituents, the board members are the parliament, for example, and you get the management, that's the bureaucracy. That's how kind of you can lay it down from a private sector point of view. So we get to the last thing that I just want to point out something at the one other problem in the governance, the Saudi Vision 2030 governance structure, is the overlap between the three levels. As you can see, the only problem that also creates more complexity, other than that would add to the incentives, is that you find ministers and their portfolios exist in all the three levels. So that's like the kind of overlap that creates even more, I would say, um, political interactions, political biograph, or whatever that could add to complexity of the incentives in the first place. So that's one other problem that I wanted to go over. And then at the end, we're looking at the policy recommendation introduced in the paper. It's not really necessary to have exactly the same structure that is recommended here. I mean, basically what you would do is just, we do have the Shura Council, but we do have the Council of Ministers. So all we got to do is just the take out the legislation functions or legislature functions from the Council of Minister, and then instill it in the Shura Council, or put it in the Shura Council, and that would kind of like solve the problem. But to do that, we need just a transition structure, which is what I recommended here. Is that we'll split the Council of Ministers into two councils, completely separate. There's no overlap. One takes care of the execution function, and the other takes care of the legislative function. And that's just a start until like the transition gets really, moves smoothly until it gets to a point where we, find it comfortably to move the legislative function completely to the Shura Council. That's exactly what I wanted. This is a summary of what I wanted to go over. I mean, I took it really quick. I'm sorry if I missed something, one here, one there, but one thing here, one there, because it's like it's been, it's trying to get you familiar with it, but not to explain it fully. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction to the work. I see already there's some pretty detailed questions that are starting to pile up, and we'll get to those. But beforehand, I would like, because I took a quick look at some of our participants coming and going, and I see that, from what I understand, probably about 30–40% are coming from the region, and the others are going to be coming from basically everywhere. And I was wondering if you wouldn't mind taking maybe a step back and giving us a bit of a contextualization of the 2030 project of Vision 2030 in general. Maybe tell us a little bit about why the 2030 vision was initiated, what were some of the drivers of it, what are if there are some kind of demographic pushes for it. I mean, where did it all come from in the beginning?
Well, this is actually a very good question, because if we all remember, before the Saudi vision was approved and published, MBS and Crown Prince was speaking and talking have said several statements through his interviews, whether it's Bloomberg or somewhere else. And it seems like it was pointed on like a really great reform. One was related to the bureaucracy itself. And the second was related to, of course, the demographics and the cultural, or I would say anything related to the people themselves. So the first one was based on building synergy between the bureaucracy. We've seen how many councils and institutions were actually terminated, and it will all consolidated in two councils at the beginning. And that's to unify the strategic leadership of the country. And then from that point, and of course, at the same time, there was a great fiscal reform within the fiscal policy. That's the two main things I think the vision was about, was building the synergy, and then focus on building the country and the whole environment, the culture, and everything. And of course, there was some talk about the social contract in the same interviews, because that was an introduction at the beginning. It was kind of preparing the people of reforms that related to the subsidies, the socialist policies that was implemented back then, and also to the introduction of taxes. And and of course, that was the VAT, because for the first time ever, just before the introduction of the Vision 2030, there was a big turnaround on how to diversify the economy and what to focus on, because one comment came out really clearly from MBS at that point was to diversify the government income at that point, at government investment, which is one of the biggest reforms at that moment, relying on other means of financing like taxes for the first time ever in Saudi. Of course, after that, we've seen like many changes in different aspects. I can't really summarize most of them, but it's, I wouldn't say it's a complete changes in culture and everything, because I think people were ready. We just needed the transformation of the government more than transformation of the people, which explains what happened later on when lots of policies that was been in there for many years that has been taken out, and things like change, including women driving, for example. So it was a complete reform to sound.
Can I just ask you a very quick follow-up on that particular question before I move to my second question? We're in 2020 now. What does Saudi Arabia look like in 2030? So what are the areas, just so our audience is all on the same page, what are the main key areas that will be changed within this decade?
Honestly, I wouldn't know. Because it's like, that's one of the reasons that I produced the papers, because I want us to stick to what we have planned to achieve from the beginning. But to do that, we need to kind of like, we need to fix this issue with the execution and with the implementation, because otherwise it's going to take us more than 20 or 30 years to go over this evolution of transformation in the country, because because of the incentives, things could easily change. Goals, objectives could easily change, just because they found it difficult to execute. And the problem to see that difficulty in execution is because we have a problem with the structure of governance and the bureaucracy, and we need to split those two functions in two separate institutions. So yes, we hope that we would see Saudi in 10 years. It's exactly what we aimed for Saudi to be through the Vision 2030, which is we reduce the reliance on oil and the growth of the economy 10, 20, or maybe 100 times, hopefully, inshallah, and then, but that would not happen if we don't accelerate this transformation by fixing both of the separation of those two functions within the system. So yeah, it would be difficult to answer this question right now, because we're at 2020 is it's a milestone year, and nobody knows exactly what might happen after.
Thank you. So let me move on to a little bit of a different, well, it's definitely related to the last bit of your answer now, which is, if you right now could set your priority list of attainable, you put together a very comprehensive list of recommendations. Maybe you can set us like the 1, 2, 3 of the priority list, and what is attainable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that question is right on, because it's like, the next thing right after we do the recommendation for separating those two functions, the executive and the legislative functions, what we need to do is decentralize bureaucracy. You see, we have been approaching decentralization in a wrong way, I think, in the past 10 years or 20 years. I would say 20 years. If you probably heard about the local councils, there were some elections and past 15 years, and the municipal councils. with the participation of the people. I think that was an attempt to decentralize the legislative function, which I think it's too early to decentralize for now. What we need to decentralize is the bureaucracy. And what I mean by decentralizing bureaucracy is exactly what we have in Al Jubail wa Yamba. We don't have a local government. We only have central government in Saudi, and that actually produces a lot of problems, a lot of issues, and the execution. We don't see that in Al Jubail or Yamba Sanaya because they have industrial Yamba because they have a local government. And they're not really, so it's like it's the best example of what we need from the paper, like separation of functions of bureaucracy and executive and legislative. And then they have all of the, because the bureaucracy is decentralized, they have everything in one management, one administration, where in the rest of the cities in Saudi, we have a single administration for each section of the city. And they don't work together under one administration. They work autonomously with their own ministry at the central government level. So it's not even efficient. It's not even kind of like helpful or helpful in the execution or to achieve the goals and all that stuff. That's one. The second thing that I think that would be helpful also as a public policy is changing the Saudization policies here. We have which I wouldn't call it actually Saudization policy. It's the immigration policy. I think we have an issue with the immigration policy that might not help us even with reaching our goals in the 2030, because it doesn't really put enough regulations to help us, let's say, get the right, I would say, productivity from using foreign labor, and also creating jobs for the local, for the Saudis. So that's actually a big subject that would like to see, but it was mentioned, and MBS's one of MBS interviews when he said that we have about 10 million jobs, occupied, filled with foreign laborers that we could turn it completely to Saudis. I think it's a big number, and I don't think Saudi would survive with doing Saudization this way, all the jobs. We still need foreign laborers, foreign experts, and everywhere. So what we need is just to reform the immigration policy. So instead of having temporary foreign laborers, we should have immigration at that level, where because it's not just gonna fix the labor market, it's also gonna help us increase the growth of our economy, because we're increasing the consumer space, not just labor. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's a long subject. We cannot
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's a very good. Yeah. And I see. I also don't want to take all the time. Just for those who are paying attention now, well, not paying attention. For those who are listening, I assume everybody's paying attention this year. You'll have the opportunity to ask questions. Methodologically, there's an option to upvote questions under the question and answer, which means that if more than one person wants a question to be asked, the same question, you can like it and it will go up the list. And I will answer the questions ask the questions rather in kind of descending order. But before I do, I have one more question for you, Mohammed. Are you an optimist or a pessimist? I often ask this question almost all the time when I do moderation, but I think it's very important to see you as an observer of what's happening inside of Saudi Arabia. Are you optimistic about what's happening internally? Are you pessimistic? I mean, what's your view?
Actually, I'm 100% optimistic. as I told you before, one of the reasons that I'm publishing this paper is just to accelerate the transformation. Instead of waiting 20 years or 30 years to get to the point that we would like to get to, I'd like to have it like in a few years, so we would be able to actually evolve and grow and reach our goals faster than we're supposed to. That's for one. The other thing is that I think I'll take this opportunity to explain something. Like, this complexity is what providing, I think it's what's creating, let's say, the non-objective narrative about what happens in Saudi. So of course, all of the followers Saudi from they would take their information from international news, and because the media, I mean, there's not enough media coverage in the region that would create the narrative that would be able to reach out people outside Saudi. So sometimes some of the narratives, they really exaggerated more than there actually is. I mean, if you look at the if you what I'm presenting in the paper is just like one of the complexity in there. So there's a lot of the things that happen on the ground that they seem to be really bad, but they're not really bad. It has a different explanation, but because there's no one to explain it, it's being explained differently. So yes, I am optimistic about what's going to happen in Saudi. I think the changes that we went through from 2015, if it wasn't for current leaders, for MDS's actions, it would have taken us like 20 or 30 years more just to get to where we are today.
Thank you very much. It's important to get that kind of feedback as well.
Yeah.
All right. Without further ado, we'll turn now to the questions and question and answer. The first, it's kind of a string of questions, question comments. I'm going to deal with the first three, first 4 points from Abdullah Al-Sheikh. He noted that he's had the opportunity to read the paper in depth. He looked at it and asked why there wasn't an update to 2020 information. So I think for methodologically, perhaps you could explain a little bit as to the reason why data was 2018 more focused. He then turns and asks about the discussion on bureaucracy. He notes that in his view, it's public administration question, or about reform challenges versus governance. And so perhaps you can comment a bit on that. And then finally, perhaps you could talk about structure, council of ministers, legislative, executive, judicial powers. And he sees it as a kind of misconception, or that actually that you see it as that it may be misconceived by you, where the council of minister combines legislative, executive power, while the judicial is somehow independent with its own chief justice, board of high courts. So perhaps if you'd like to make a couple of comments.
Absolutely. He's actually right on about these questions. They're very interesting, and I like them. So the reason why it wasn't updated, there's not much that happened that changed the principle of the papers. So there's not much that's needed to actually have it changed, to be honest. That's what I think. Like even like the slightest changes doesn't really change that we still have problems between the two functions. It's just that I might, like, if I would update it, I would like to add more evidence, provide more evidence, recent evidence maybe, that could support some of the claims in there. So that's what. Can I? What's the second question? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
The second question was about.
I can see it. Yeah,
you see
it's
it?
Answered. Yeah. So yeah, it's bureaucracy is public administration. Of course, it is public administration, because it's in the public sector we call it public administration. The management we call it public administration. So yes, I think it's yes, it is public administration. There's not, and so he's got like a very good eye to the paper, It's in the structure of council. Yes. Well, so he's talking here about the. I wasn't really talking about I didn't really take the judicial powers in consideration in the paper. I was mostly focused on the legislative and the executive. But still, like, even though that the Supreme Court like reports to the king and everything, but still some parts of the functions of the judicial power is actually there, the council of ministers. So it's kind of like there's still some mix in there, but it's not it's not really the focus of the paper. That's why I didn't really go deep into it.
So I seem to have pushed one of the questions to be answered, but I think it should be presented as well. Abdurrahman Al-Samani has noted that he writes that he's seen your proposed structure of governance to separate the minister's role. With that proposal, aren't we going to encounter a lack of decision-making ability among senior management, and would we have centralized management instead?
We do have centralized management anyway, but so what the paper proposes at the moment is just the separation of the two functions as a step one. But step two, of course, we're going to have to do decentralizing the bureaucracy. But first, we need to separate it from the legislative, so we don't get the local government confused with all the legislative roles. You need all the executive roles and functions operating properly and without any confusion from the legislation, incentives, and all that stuff.
Great. Now we have a question from Vincenzo De Vivo. He writes that you're speaking precisely about the lack of separation of executive and legislative powers or functions within government institutions. It seems quite clear that there is no form of democracy in the studied sense of Western democracy. That is, the minimum requirements do not seem to be present in your system of government. The first requirement is free elections and separation of the executive, legislative, judicial powers, control of civil society over military. I understand that that it is not a democracy, but who proposes a bill? Who proposes a new bureaucratic leadership within the state system? Who makes decisions in an emergency? These questions may seem obvious, but I'm referring to today in 2020.
No, actually, his question is right on. It's exactly what I was talking about. Those who proposes the bill are actually the ministers. They're not, like, the king doesn't propose a bill. It has to come bottom up. That's why the bureaucratic system is confused by how to do the decision-making process. That's why, so both of the executive and the legislative functions within, like, the ministry, they do their decision-making bottom up. So it's a ministry that proposes a bill within the system. And as of electing the bureaucratic leadership, or who proposes or appointing, let's say, it's also the king. But who proposes them, or who, like, there's no public information about how this process is being done. But if you think about it, it's because the king is elected by, elected by the people in our way. We call it the legion. So he represents all of the citizens. I could call him like a global citizen in Saudi, where he would elect and appoint the ministers there. So his appointment of ministers is also electing the minister, because it's like he is the only constituent in this process, kind of.
Thank you very much. The next question is from Lamis Bartushek Khalilova. She's asking, she says, you spoke about and compared checks and balances. Historically in the Gulf, the Majlis was that platform where citizens aired their grievances. Has social media in general, and Twitter, in KSA in particular, become the new Majlis? Is it a significant platform for checks and balances? How relevant is it?
I believe checks and balances happen between institutions, not between people, like, and especially in the government. There is also checks and balance between the people and the government. So there's like different levels of checks and balances. But if the Majlis was part of the checks and balances, I don't think so. Social media probably might help. Media might help to provide these checks and balances, which is represented by the social media. I'm not sure about the Majlis. I'm not familiar exactly how it's being conducted or everything, but I doubt that it's one of the performance of checks and balances, because when you say checks and balances, one must have the power over the other to actually hold them in check and then hold them accountable and all that stuff. So in my opinion, the Majlis is not really never represented checks and balances. And today, the Majlis al-Wazara, the Council of Ministers, and the Shura Council, there is no checks and balance, really clear checks and balances between them, because they both have the legislative powers, but in different forms.
Thank you. Now, Hussam Al-Thiabi is asking if you can please explain more about the two councils of ministers. Who is going to sit on the legislative and the executive?
So it doesn't matter who's the head of the council of the two councils. It's the king and the crown prince. But what's important is that the members of those councils, as mentioned in the paper, is that it has to be completely separate. There's no overlap, that to avoid any conflict of interest, because that's one of the problems in the overlaps that happens within the government. And within the vision, it actually creates situations where there's a conflict of interest, and that kind of like create politics, it create power grab, it actually against the synergy that it's needed in these type of institutions. So yeah, the two councils completely separate, members separate, and they have to do like checks and balances on each other.
Thank you. There was one question that I kind of, I think I skipped over, but the author of the question was asking, going back to the specifics of your paper, about whether or not the US example is a fair comparison with Saudi Arabia, or if it would have been perhaps, important to see states that are more similar to one another. So maybe, I mean, I know from a level of scholarship, you choose cases not only on the basis sometimes of similarities, but also on the basis of differences, and sometimes on the basis of learning from one another. I mean, this is the social sciences after all. But perhaps you could talk a little bit about why in the paper you do that comparison.
That's actually a very good question, because it's like I chose the United States because, in my opinion, they have the best situations, best literature about separation of bureaucracy and legislature specifically. Those different acts, those different papers written, different point of views. So that's why I chose it. And the second reason is that I'm not really discussing the structural governance or the principles of separation powers in a government. I'm only discussing the incentives here, because that's what's really important at this moment, is that the incentives are not really helping the institution perform, the bureaucracy. So I mean, if I would choose some other countries or other literature, it might not be, I think, developed or evolved as it's in the States. That's probably, I don't want to sound biased, but some of the countries, they don't have like a proper separation between legislative and the executive branches of the government. You would see like there are some overlaps. Like for example, in Ireland, there's an overlap. Australia, there's an overlap. So I think it's better to take it as from one angle, which is the incentives, because that's what you need the bureaucracy to do, is to perform better, and then you could do the same analysis on your country and see exactly what's happening to their incentives, because that's what's happening in Saudi, is when you have both of the functions in one institution, that's what happened, because it's like it's either the politicians controlling bureaucracy or the bureaucrats controlling politics. In Saudi, it's like it's kind of like both the same, because both of the functions are in one institution. But like in Ireland, for example, there is a separation between the parliament and the bureaucracy, but there is one that has control over the other. In other countries, I don't know how that would be. When I say control, I'm saying like it's different than having power over it. Because when I say control, is that they could use, like a politician could use this bureaucracy to help them get reelected again, for example. So that's what I mean by control. So that's the reason why I chose the American literature, because they went too far into this line of separating bureaucracy from the legislature institutions.
Well, thank you very much. I think this concludes our session. For those who still have not had the opportunity to read Mohammed's work, I put the link already on the chat area. If you scroll up to the top, you'll have the access to that. And I would like, I mean, I know I'm the only person now in the moderation, but let's say on behalf of everybody, I'm putting together a collective applause. Thank you very much for your insights. Also, thank you very much for your exhaustive study. It was very important. And I think that, you know, just to put it in perspective, how many hundreds of people have visited our page just to look at your report. It's truly phenomenal to see that this kind of conversation needs to be had. And I'm so happy that you're having and leading this conversation, and very happy to work with you in the future on these types of topics. There's a last minute question that just popped in just as I was about to wrap up from Abdallah Humayed, who says, doesn't the often changing ministers, when they have been in their position less than 2 years, hurt the 2030 process? So I think the ministerial rotation is the question. Maybe as a last 2 seconds, you can drop some information for this.
Absolutely. This is actually one of the main implications that I mentioned in the paper, is that changing the ministers right now with having both of the functions within the ministry actually destroys all of the progress that's been taking place by the previous minister or replaced minister. So yes, so it's dangerous right now because there is no legacy. Whenever there is a minister is being replaced, his legacy of work and everything is gone. It's completely gone. So the new minister will come and change everything. Will probably won't rely on the previous effort or progress or whatever was there, and for their own reasons. And then, of course, it's gonna like jeopardize the whole thing, the whole execution. That's exactly why what's happening, what's been happening, and that's why MBS himself is frustrated. If you follow the news about certain projects and certain, you know, delay in progress, some of the projects.
And so once again, so thank you again for all the questions, and thank you for taking the time to go through the paper and explaining it to us. Looking very much forward to the next time, after the next exhaustive study, of course. But and until then, on behalf of everybody here in EGIC and everybody who's participated today, thank you so much for your time. And inshallah, after the pandemic, we'll be able to see you in one room. We can have a big negotiation like this.
Inshallah. All right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.